Welcome to Argument Basics. In this brief video, we'll take a look at a type of inductive argument known as the analogical argument, sometimes referred to as the argument by analogy. So essentially there are three ways analogies are used. There's the argument by analogy, which we'll look at, and of course people also do analogies that are rhetorical, comparing one thing to another for the purpose of persuasion. So for example, we might say to praise somebody that they are as solid as a rock, or we might say that they're as brave as a lion, or to mock someone, we might say they're as brave as a mouse. Now, there are also, say, literary analogies, where you're comparing things, the point being like with aesthetics. So you might, in Romeo and Juliet, have, Juliet is a sun, arise, fair sun, and slay the envious moon. And it's saying, that Juliet is analogous to the sun, not that she's like a big burning ball of gas, but that she's like pretty and stuff. Now, our concern is with not these types. We're also not concerned with what's called an explanatory analogy, where you offer a comparison in the hopes that because a person understands one thing, they'll understand what it's being compared to. So, for example, if you're explaining American football to a European and you know the rules of like rugby, you might draw an analogy between rugby and American football, for example. Now, our concern is with the analogical argument. So it's analogical, so it involves a comparison between things. And it's an argument, so of course it's got premises and a conclusion. So the definition is this. It's an argument in which you conclude that two things are alike in a certain respect because they're alike in these other respects. So the idea being, hey, these two things are alike in these ways, so they're alike in this other way that I'm concerned with. So informally, we often use them, very simply, just saying one thing is like another in these ways, so it's like, so they're alike in this other way we're concerned with. So a person might say, for example, suppose we're talking about privacy and, drones. You might say, well, would flying a drone up to somebody's window and using the cameras to peer in, would that be a violation of privacy? And you might say, well, by analogy, this would be kind of like going up and putting a ladder against the side of their house, going up the ladder and peering into their bedroom. And that would clearly be a violation of privacy. Therefore, we could infer by analogy, because these are alike, both the ladder and the drone, let people to peek in places where we assume shouldn't be peeking, that just as spying on someone by putting a ladder up to their window and peering in would be wrong, flying a drone up to their window and peering in would be wrong. Now, most people, again, make analogies fairly informally, but since it's an argument, it does have a form, and people, aside from philosophers, rarely lay it out this way. But here's the strict form. So the first premise is X, whatever it is you're talking about, has certain properties, P, Q, and R. X is whatever you're talking about, say a drone or peeking through somebody's window with a ladder or whatever. And the P, Q, and R are variables. They're standing for whatever properties that you're concerned with, whatever features X has. In premise 2, you present the second thing, Y, and you establish that it has similar properties, P, Q, and R, whatever those properties might be. Then in premise 3, you establish that X has the property that you're concerned with, say being a violation of privacy, for example. So you establish that X has property Z in addition to P, Q, and R. So you conclude that because X has P, Q, and R, Y has P, Q, and R, X also has Z, by analogy, Y has property Z. Going back to the example, you might say that putting a ladder against somebody's window allows one to peer in and you gain access to someplace where a person probably shouldn't have access to. You could say a drone has similar properties. You can reach places up high and peer into places like through someone's window. But we generally would agree that putting a ladder against someone's house and peering through their bedroom window would be morally wrong. Probably pretty certainly illegal as well, although I'm no lawyer. And so we would infer that using the drone this way would have that property as well. It would be immoral, possibly illegal. Although you'd always want to talk, of course, to the relevant lawyers about drone law. So when you build an analogy, how do you tell when you got a good one and a bad one? Well, there's a general assessment that applies to all arguments. You do an assessment of, well, given the premises, assuming they're true, would the conclusion probably be true? Now, in the case of inductive arguments, we don't use truth tables or proofs or Venn diagrams to check them for strength. We have standards that we apply. And this means that all the different inductive arguments have different standards, and there's a degree of subjectivity. People can have reasonable good faith disputes about whether the standard is met, not met, met badly, etc. So as you might imagine with an inductive analogical argument, since it's an analogy, it's about how much they're alike. That's kind of the obvious standard. A bit more formally, here are the 3 standards. The first is the number of properties they have in common. The more things they have that are shared, the better the argument. Now, of course, merely having a lot in common doesn't guarantee it's a good argument. I mean, it makes it better than if they have less stuff. But if you think about comparing things, you could find a lot of similarities between all kinds of things. For example, got my coffee cup here, and my coffee cup and I have a lot of similarities. We're both in this room. We're both on the planet Earth. We're both in Tallahassee. We're both composed of matter. We both, contain water at this point. In the case some coffee. We both contain coffee now, and we both have shape, mass, density, volume, etc. And you could spend all day listing the similarities between me and the coffee cup. But if you were to say, well, I'm a philosophy professor, my coffee cup is like me, therefore my coffee cup is a professor, you'd probably think that's probably not a good argument, despite all those shared properties. That's why we have the other important standard, which is this: the relevance of those shared properties to the thing you're concerned about. So how relevant are those qualities? To go with my silly coffee cup example, having shape, density, mass, and volume, although philosophy professors have those qualities, unless there's any ghost, philosophy professors, those really aren't relevant to deciding that something or somebody's a philosophy professor. You'd look for other, relevant qualities. The third standard is differences. So the more different the two things are in relevant ways, the worse the comparison. And this can be distilled down to sort of one broad standard, which is this: the more relevant things they have in common, the better the argument. The more things they have that are relevant that are different, the worse the argument. Or even more simply, the more alike they are, the better. The more different they are, the worse the argument, the weaker it is. So let's go back to our drone example. So if we're assessing that, if we wanted to assess the morality of using drones, to peer at people, a good comparison would be, comparing it to using a ladder or binoculars, for example. So do they have properties in common, and are they relevant? Well, one assessment, of course, would be in terms of relevant properties. The drone and the ladder both allow access to places that you wouldn't be able to get to normally. The drone by flying, the ladder by allowing a person to, get up to higher places. Peering through somebody's window in person allows one to see, into their window where they would normally expect people not to be able to see. And the drone allows one to do a similar thing, peer into places where people normally think people couldn't peer, like a backyard that's fenced in, or like a upper story, window. Are these relevant to the morality? And it seems reasonable to think that they are, because in the case of peering through somebody's window using a ladder, that seems to be a privacy violation, probably also, trespassing, etc. And in the case of the drone, it allows one to do a similar thing. The important thing is being able to see what a person morally really doesn't have a right to see, namely in places where people think they and have a reasonable expectation of privacy, like in their bedroom or in their fenced-in backyard, from a moral standpoint. For the laws, talk to a lawyer. And so it seemed to be a reasonably strong argument that if it's wrong to put a ladder against somebody's house and peer through their bedroom window, then it'd be wrong to fly a drone and peer into their window as well. Now, a person, of course, could argue against this, because there are differences between, obviously, drones and ladders. In the case of the ladder, you would have to be physically present, and this would involve probably trespassing, going to somebody's property physically, whereas with the drone, a person could be flying like in public space, and using, the telephoto, camera lenses to peer in. And that would be, you could say this would be similar to peering into somebody's window from a second-story window using binoculars. But then you might say, well, yeah, that's a difference. With the drone, you're not there personally peering through. With the ladder, you are, and that's an important difference. But you could argue sort of as a counter against this, and you can keep arguing back and forth, that what matters is not being physically present. That would make it even worse. What matters is being able to see into a space that a person normally wouldn't be able to, and hence there's an expectation morally of privacy. And again, this is a moral argument. For the legal stuff, talk to a lawyer. So you could make the argument, not surprisingly, that the comparison is a good one and strong, so the use of drones in this way would be immoral. And you could argue that there are differences that make it so that using a drone this way might not be immoral. So those are inductive arguments in terms of the analogical argument, comparing them. Two other quick sort of notes about these. I mentioned like legal stuff, and interestingly, quite a bit of legal argumentation is analogical arguments. You might have heard of the notion of precedent in law. Crudely put, precedent is you try to convince the judge and the jury, hey, there is this case like my case, which went the way I want my case to go, therefore my case should go this way. This oversimplifies it. But when lawyers reference other cases, they would say in Jones versus Smith, say a dispute over copyrights or something, it went this way. My case is like this case, so it should go a similar way in favor of my client. And then, of course, a counter would be probably other precedents. Like in this case, say Labossiere versus Kelly, it went this way, therefore this case should go that way. And so you'd have a argument by analogy using precedent. As a final example, medical reasoning, be it, actual doctors or personal medical reasoning, is often analogical. For example, suppose you go to medical school, you see an example of poison ivy in medical school or read about it. Then you're practicing medicine, someone comes in and they've got, itchy skin. They say they're outside, doing some cleaning out some weeds, and you would infer, it's like the case that you saw in medical school. This looks similar. Therefore, by analogy, they probably have like poison ivy or poison oak or similar thing exposure. And so quite a bit of medical reasoning is arguing by analogy. This is like the case I learned about in medical school, or the case, or if you go to WebMD, it looks like the picture on WebMD. Therefore, it's similar, looks the same, looks similar, etc. Therefore, it's poison ivy, for example. So arguments by analogy are super useful. And again, the gist of them is you're comparing two things and saying that because they're alike in these other ways, they're alike in the way you're concerned with. For example, if one thing's immoral, the other thing is immoral. Or if one thing's poison ivy, the other thing's poison ivy. If a case went this way, in a case that's like your client's case, it should go in a similar way for your client. That sort of stuff. So that takes us to the end of the analogical argument, and we'll see more arguments in the future.